So everybody has been talking about the recent landmark Supreme Court decision in Burwell versus Hobby Lobby that determined that closely held for-profit corporations, which make up the majority of existing corporations, can be exempt from laws based on religious beliefs or objections under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 that states that federal laws cannot, quote, substantially burden the exercise of religion unless that action constitutes the least restrictive means of serving a compelling government interest. That means that while these particular corporations may opt out of covering certain kinds of contraceptives for their employees, they cannot use this claim as a precedent to claim religious objection to adhering to anti-discriminatory practices against people of protected statuses, like race. Why? Because, quote, the government has a compelling interest in providing an equal opportunity to participate in the workforce without regard to race, and prohibitions on racial discrimination are precisely tailored to achieve that critical goal. Yep, just like that. But when it comes to covering certain kinds of contraceptives, the Affordable Health Care Act apparently violated the RFRA because, according to the court, it isn't the least restrictive way to provide contraceptives because the government can just pick up the tab. Alrighty. There's so much wrong with this case that it's really hard to know where to begin. The amount of worms that have been released from this can is absolutely frightening. In this particular case, Hobby Lobby wasn't objecting to all contraceptives, but just two particular kinds, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment. But this decision can, and most likely will, set a precedent for other corporations to refuse to cover other forms of contraceptives and other medications that are linked to sex and sexuality, like antiretroviral medications for HIV patients. Fuck! Hobby Lobby is owned by an evangelical family. What if they also oppose treatments involving stem cells? Fuck! And what about businesses that are owned by Jehovah's Witnesses? Can they now opt out of covering blood transfusions? Fuck! And despite Justice Alito's assurance that this decision would not give a hand in discriminating against people of protected statuses, it could be used as an excuse to discriminate against LGBT people, as sexual orientation and gender identity are not federally protected classes. Fuck! So this all came about because Hobby Lobby decided that it didn't want to have to cover emergency contraceptives like Plan B and Ella and IUDs. Their reason for this is their belief that these contraceptives cause abortions, and they have religious objections to abortion. The problem with that argument is that it's totally wrong, which means that Hobby Lobby won a case despite the fact that their arguments were incorrect. So here's how the female reproductive system works in conjunction with these contraceptives. And everybody get ready to go back to middle school human biology class. Let's start with some terminology. What is an abortion? An abortion is the termination of a pregnancy before an embryo or fetus is viable. If a pregnancy is terminated with a viable fetus, then that's called a birth. If the fetus dies in utero, that's called a stillbirth. Okay? Okay, so what is a pregnancy? A pregnancy is the implantation of a fertilized egg. Before the implantation, there's no pregnancy. There's just a fertilized egg. And if you're someone who thinks I'm just arguing semantics, then consider in vitro fertilization, in which conception takes place in a culture media. Is the petri dish pregnant? No. So fertilization alone does not a pregnancy make. Pregnancy occurs when a fertilized egg implants itself. This is supposed to occur in the uterus. If it implants elsewhere, then it is an ectopic pregnancy and must be aborted, as it is a medical emergency that risks the female's life. So, now that we have brushed up on what constitutes a pregnancy and what constitutes an abortion, let's talk about emergency contraceptives and IUDs. Emergency contraceptives are just amped up birth control pills. They have all the same hormones, just higher doses of them, so that they may prevent fertilization or ovulation after unprotected sex or the failure of some other form of contraception. That's it. As for IUDs, they prevent fertilization by killing sperm. If some sperm manage to survive the IUD and an egg gets fertilized, the IUD can prevent implantation. Therefore, since neither emergency contraceptives nor IUDs cause the destruction or rejection of a fertilized egg after implantation, better known as pregnancy, then they are not abortifacients. They're not. As I've already pointed out, this is not a matter of semantics. This is science. Bitch. And personal and religious beliefs do not trump the facts. They are not abortifacients. So Hobby Lobby won a Supreme Court case by making a totally incorrect claim about particular kinds of contraceptives and using that claim to plead religious objection. How did this not get examined in court? Fuck! The court also decided that Hobby Lobby's owners' beliefs that life begins at conception to be valid religious grounds to opt out of providing coverage for these kinds of contraceptives. But my question is, if a religious belief has absolutely no basis in science, then how can it be constitutional to impose it on other people? And no, science does not state that life began at conception. Science states that life began about 3.5 billion years ago and has since then been a non-stop continuous cycle of sexual and asexual reproduction. As P.Z. Myers, someone who we often forget is an evolutionary biologist, correctly stated, there was no step between you and your parents that wasn't already alive, like the egg and the sperm that joined together to eventually become you. So, just as with the claims about emergency contraceptives and IUDs, a for-profit corporation claimed religious reasons to impose a restriction on their employees' healthcare coverage based on something that is demonstrably wrong. How is this constitutional? As I've stated many times in the past, what they are really arguing is that personhood begins at conception. And the concept of personhood is something that science really doesn't dip into. That's a matter of philosophy and legality, but ironically, the only matter of personhood that was discussed in this case was corporate personhood. It's not a person, goddammit! If a fertilized egg can be medically classified as a disease, as in the case of molar pregnancies, then the argument that personhood begins at conception is just fucked! There's one more problem that I have with this ruling. As this involved emergency contraceptives and IUDs, obviously this only affects female employees of Hobby Lobby. It can be argued that Hobby Lobby is imposing discriminatory obstructions to healthcare based on sex, which is a protected status, cloaked as a religious exemption. That might be a harder case to fight, but it's definitely one that I wouldn't mind seeing being tried. Before I go, I want to quickly mention something on a totally different subject. I recently made 2 videos for the Breakfast Club channel talking about Patreon. I'm not going to repeat what I've already said in those videos, so please check them out afterward. Links are below. Long story short, I don't have a Patreon and I have no plans to create one. But you can still help me out a lot. Do you remember back when you would subscribe to a channel and every time that channel had a new video, it would automatically show up in your subscription feed? Yeah, good times. But one day YouTube decided that that just wasn't how they were going to do things anymore. And as such, I'm quite certain that my videos are no longer showing up in the majority of my subscribers' feeds. So if you really want to support my channel, please share my videos. Keep watching. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and tell people that they should subscribe to me and watch me because I'm brilliant and funny and clever. What, you think I'm kidding? Happy 4th of July. Fuck! Nothing, I just had to get one more in there.